The Hellcat motor is arguably one of the most iconic engines of the 21st century, and it was the cheat code to help the aging Dodge Challenger and Charger platforms stay relevant for years longer than they otherwise should have been compared to the Camaro and the Mustang. The 700 plus horsepower gamble paid off for Dodge when they sold over 100,000 Hellcat powered cars to date, and they made a boatload of money with them before the poor management decisions of today started. But some 6 decades earlier, there was another brand barely hanging on by a thread, and that was Studebaker. With dwindling sales numbers and record losses happening year after year, they needed to think outside the box and do something to drum up excitement for their aging cars. Forged in the company's final days, a cash-strapped Studebaker would be one of the earliest adopters of the supercharged V8. And while it wasn't enough to save the brand, their series of supercharged V8s were powerhouses in their day, and the cars that they came in were really the original Hellcats, specifically the incredibly rare Studebaker Super Lark R2. Now, in the early 1960s, Studebaker was a company teetering on the edge of financial ruin. Once a dominant player in the American automotive landscape, Studebaker found itself struggling to compete with the big three automakers, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. After their first bankruptcy in the 1930s and their subsequent revival shortly after, the Studebaker brand was always kind of in a limbo. It had some great years post-World War II, but as the big three ramped up their production volume and lowered their margins in an effort to sell more cars, Studebaker was stuck. Their labor costs to build a car were outrageously expensive compared to the other brands, and this price war crushed them. By 1953, they were hemorrhaging cash. Studebaker merged with the also struggling Packard Corporation a year later in 1954, but even then the outlook was still grim. The company hadn't turned a real profit in years. It was a sinking ship. They had virtually no money for retooling or for any real research and development. And to add insult to injury, key personnel kept leaving the company and kicking the can down the road. Bankruptcy was recommended, but the brand soldiered on, unwilling to cave in just yet. Virtually every car that Studebaker made by the late 1950s were just rebadged and reworked versions of their early 1950s models because they simply did not have the money to pay for the tooling required for totally new body designs. But there was a glimmer of hope. Right around this time, the Rambler brand had started to take off, selling budget-focused economy cars that the big three didn't offer yet. Studebaker saw this and figured they had nothing to lose, so they would jump on the bandwagon too, except they had to do it on the cheap. They raided their own parts bin and prior models to create a hastily made but affordable compact by using the center section of a 1953 Studebaker Champion with a cut wheelbase, a 1955 model year Studebaker windshield, and literally any part they could find in storage to use on the car. Cobbled together in less than a year, their new compact car, named the Lark, wasn't anything special. But because it beat the Ford Falcon and Chevy Corvair to market, this little Studebaker had a key first mover advantage, and it managed to shoot the company back into profitability. This 108-inch wheelbase economy car was styled sort of as a mix of some of the Chrysler products of the day, like the Valiant, and it also borrowed some European influence. Sure, the Lark was a quirky-looking car by pretty much every metric when it first came out, but it was selling well, which was more than could be said for most of Studebaker's lineup. Initially available with an inline-six or the near 200 horsepower Studebaker 259 cubic inch V8. The 2,600-pound Stude actually wasn't that slow with the V8, and it could be had with a 3-speed manual and even eventually a 4-speed manual as well. Things were looking up. Studebaker, though, instead of reinvesting the profits that they generated from the Lark into new cars, chose to diversify their company holdings with other non-car brands to try and stabilize revenue. which meant that the Lark remained largely unchanged as the Falcon and Corvair came onto the scene. In 1960, due to a disagreement with the board, the CEO of Studebaker was ousted, as the board was seeing the writing on the wall, and they wanted to get out of the car business. They instilled their new CEO, Sherwood Egbert, who was relatively young. Now, Egbert did not come from an automotive background per se, but he worked at the McCulloch Motors Corporation, who made power tools and even superchargers. But upon getting the position at Studebaker, he began to dive headfirst into and eventually fall in love with the automotive industry. And his goal shifted from saving the company through diversification to actually saving Studebaker's struggling automotive lineup. And since Studebaker had now acquired McCulloch, that meant that their superchargers were now vertically integrated into their business model, which made them an ideal choice for future performance cars. Egbert himself, being on the younger side at 40 years old when he took the helm of Studebaker, envisioned a crucial part of the next chapter of the company as performance, similar to what Tim Kuniskis did with Dodge and the Hellcats. To appeal to a younger demographic, Studebaker had to do whatever it could in reason to shave off that stigma of their older and not that exciting cars. And as his first order of business, Egbert had the Lark itself redesigned and facelifted in 1962, with a new set of dual headlights and just a more competitive and modern overall design. He also started on the process to build the iconic Studebaker Avanti, which would be the new halo car for the brand. Unfortunately for the Lark, though, it was beginning to get outclassed by the Big Three's new offerings, so Studebaker had to do something to change public perception in their favor. Now, by the late 1950s, Studebaker was experimenting with their supercharged Company V8 in cars like the Golden Hawk. But now with Egbert at the helm and Andy Gratelli on board, the supercharged Studebaker V8 was about to get a lot more interesting, as was the Lark. The standard Studebaker V8 and 6-cylinder options were still available for the Lark, but for those performance-minded buyers, there were some new, exciting V8 options available, of which there were two core versions. The R1, which was the naturally aspirated high-performance version of the Studebaker 289 V8, with a 4-barrel carburetor that made 240 horsepower. Then there was the R2, which was the same core motor just fitted with a centrifugal supercharger that now had the boost turned up to between 6 and 8 psi, thus giving the R2 powered Larks 290 horsepower. There was also the even more mythical R3, which was a 304.5 cubic inch version of the supercharged R2 motor. These were beefed up some more and made 335 horsepower, but it's rumored that there may have only been like one to a handful of Larks with the R3 motors built at most. Remember, with the R2 powered Larks, these were still sub 2,800 pound cars. So 290 horsepower in these was no joke in the early 60s. But by 1963, things got even better for the Studebaker Lark with the introduction of the Super Lark package. This was tactically released later on after the Avanti had already hit the market as an effort to try not to cannibalize its sales. Available only with the R1 or R2 motor packages, the Super Lark was a $600 option back in 1963, on top of the already expensive R1 and R2 motors. The Super Lark package added front disc brakes, radius rods to help wheel hop in the rear, stiffer springs, adjustable shocks, and a limited slip rear diff affectionately called the twin traction rear, which was available with anywhere from a 331 gear set all the way up to an insane 455 rear gear ratio. A Borg-Warner T10 4-speed manual transmission was also available on the Super Larks. These Larks, which started off as $2,100 economy cars, ballooned in price with all these options to just about $3,700 with the supercharger and the R2 package, just $300 cheaper than a base Corvette. The R2 Super Larks, as tested, could do a 7.3 second 0 to 60 sprint and clock off the quarter-mile time in the 15-second range with a 354 geared rear. It was likely much faster with the 455s. And the rumored top speed for these cars with the lower gear ratios was about 130 miles per hour as well, which wasn't bad at all when you consider that this car hit the market before the Pontiac GTO even did. Nonetheless, even though on paper the Super Larks offered great performance numbers, getting people to shell out near Corvette money for a hopped-up economy car was a tough sell. And unlike the Hellcat, the Super Lark was a sales flop. Only around 300 R2 supercharged Super Larks were built, plus the R1 cars, before Studebaker bid us goodbye as a US automaker. The brand tried to stay afloat with its Canadian manufacturing facility, but it was like putting a band-aid on a bullet hole, and eventually the company folded. Parts for these cars today are few and far between, but there is a loyal fan base out there that still cherishes these cars for what they were. And yeah, they're nowhere near as fast as a modern Hellcat or nearly as much of a sales success. But the DNA is really kinda the same. Both brands took their aging platforms and shoehorned a supercharged V8 underneath to try and increase sales. For Dodge, they had the money to execute it and the marketing behind it. Studebaker, though, was able to make all of this happen with a company that barely made any money. The fact that they were even able to make the Lark at all is almost a miracle, let alone create a super high-performance supercharged version that had features that even some of the baddest American cars of the era didn't, is a testament to the ingenuity of the brand. With limited resources, they gave it their best shot, and that best shot turned out to be pretty damn cool. Now, if you have any stories or personal notes about the R1 or R2 Studebaker Larks, then please share them down below in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And as always, thank you all for watching another video. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out. But otherwise, I will see you next time, enthusiasts.